So a few days ago, someone raised the question of whether or not we can use Western approaches or a knowledge of Western architecture to study the architecture currently in China. And I was wondering what you thought about that, considering that there are buildings here built by non-Chinese, by foreigners, and so on. How would you approach studying the architecture in China?
Like you, I'm a layman. I'm just beginning to get interested. So I use all approaches. I certainly have been doing some reading about Western architecture. I'm trying to bring up on my architectural history, all Western style. Yeah. But I'm also a cultural historian, so I have my own biases. I like to give you another example, which originally included in my material, but ARCWA said 45 minutes, so I did exactly 45 minutes. And that's the Xintiandi. I'm sure most of you have been to Xintiandi, right? It is, on the surface, a Western architectural idea, because the whole master planner is someone from Boston, the guy who redesigned the flaneur, not flaneur, the other, not flaneur. Benjamin, what's his name? Right. The idea is to use Chinese materials. They destroy the whole area, the Linong area, but they used the bricks. But the idea was Western. I rather like the idea, namely, is the agora idea. You have to make it open. The Linong world is closed. You have to enter into it. Then you enter into a kind of Gemeinschaft world, human relations and all that. But it is locked by a gate, the Shikumen, right? So they destroyed that idea using some of the bricks to construct a very open idea. If you walk into Xintiandi, of course, the whole thing is wide open. You can enter in any way, any direction, right? And then, of course, as you walk into little alleys, which of course resemble or symbolize the old Linong alleys, right? So it looks like Venice, right? With lamps and all that. And then if you look closely at the bricks, you can see that you have old bricks and new bricks. And one of the engineers told me that, in fact, they injected some kind of a preservative stuff into the old bricks so that they can last longer. So now here is, at least on paper, or even in reality, a Western design that works, except for one crucial issue for me as a cultural historian or the cultural studies scholar. That is that who is going to use it? If it is a good design, it is an open design. If it is follow the old agora idea, all citizens should be there, right? But now, of course, only the rich, only the nouvelle rich or the Western rich, whatever rich. Most of my Hong Kong and my Shanghai friends, including most of the intellectuals, they consider that building fake. I was trying to defend it, but they think the whole thing is fake, because the Shanghainese will never like it. But here, of course, you're talking about two kinds of Shanghainese, the old Shanghainese and the new Shanghainese. The new Shanghainese are the Haigui Pai, the people who are educated abroad, coming back like Hu Ying. Hu Ying doesn't belong to that crowd. No. Because he's so well cultured. But you're not talking about, people with Harvard business degrees, who comes in with loads of money, who comes in to have a cup of coffee. I mean, it's a typical man. This is the world of Shanghai Baby, that famous novel, right? So why would a good piece of design by a concerned Western designer, because this Boston person apparently made 300 visits to the site in order to come up with this idea. We could question the idea, we could debate about the idea, but we cannot question his sincerity, because he's really trying to match the West with the, here's a kind of a concern. I'm not a very sort of radical, politically correct person. Not all Westerners are bad guys. But once you put that into a situation, you see what I call the degeneration of the youth. It's a different form of decadence, to quote ARCWA, with twisted, decadence, right? It's a different form of decadence, not the good side, but bad side. let's face it, most buildings, most architectures are Western. I don't believe that you can have an authentic Chinese notion. You can have the old pagoda reproduced in a new way. No, I don't believe that. I think the point to explore is what kind of a mix, what kind of spirit, and what kind of a creative theory within which you conceptualize your idea.
I'm sort of interested, I have been for a while, in this idea of Coolhouse approaching China as tabula rasa and other foreign architects as well, and kind of the way that this gets turned into a critique, when I think there's another way to read that in the sense of like the idea that Coolhouse, as a member of the kind of 68 generation of Western intellectuals, then ends up in this kind of neutral position vis-a-vis the Communist Party, and that his exuberance, say circa 96, about Shenzhen and sort of skyscrapers being designed in 3 and 4 days, which was another line similar to the one you quoted about the work of 5,000 Western architects in a year, actually in a weird way becomes the ideological grounding for things like the success of the Olympic bid, and for basically, Western ultimate ambivalence aside, a fundamental tenor of exuberance in relation to the so-called rise of China. And I mean, say what you will about his architecture and about the actual ideas, inherent in the buildings. I mean, I think there's this incredible irony that, first of all, he does design the headquarters for the largest propaganda machine in the world in a completely interesting way that actually owes a lot to Cities on the Move, which was an avant-garde art exhibition that he was involved in at about the same time. But ultimately, that part of that building is burnt down by exactly the flaws in this system that cannot be corrected, right? The corrupt bureaucrat who hosts a big fireworks party and essentially torches, what has then, what they've just spent billions of dollars on. So I'm just, I don't know, I'm always interested in trying to complicate this idea of East and West and these architects who come and do things, because of course they have a certain knowledge project behind what they're doing and have flaws in different kinds of ways, but there's ultimately like a multiplicity of readings that could actually accomplish different kinds of work in relation to what they're doing here. And I think that a lot of times the conversation tends to focus too much on these kind of constructed ideas of what is Chinese and what is Western and how to keep the two in some sort of balance. So I'm just sort of, I'd be curious really, I mean, it sounds like you actually really like Coolhouse on one level too.
I understand. In fact, I have a good friend who is a Shanghai architect now, who is a student of Coolhouse's. I certainly respect Coolhouse as a scholar. I have nothing against him myself, nor do I want him to be a kind of representative figure of the East-West divide. My whole theory is not built on that. But actually, I was quoting some of their sayings, namely China as a tabula rasa. It's not my words, it's their words. And I took offense precisely on these quotations. There's a collection of essays by some of the leading architects. I think they were talking about their project. This was published, I think, about 10 or 20 years ago, which I read. They all said the same thing. I will try to find a quotation for you. Hopefully, of course, they have matured too, right? Now, I would say, on what basis could any architect from any culture say that here's a tabula rasa, I can do anything I want with it? I mean, that's the form of egomania that I certainly do not like. How would architects become egomaniacs? That's an old story, that you know. Perhaps in 5 years, there will have a lot of Chinese egomaniac Chinese architects. I'm now keeping a close watch on this guy, Rocco Yin, who is a friend of mine, to see what his new construct is going to be. He just won the bid to build the government headquarters in Tianmalan area. We'll see how that construction will be. But he looks like a rather sort of self-abashed man. Who knows? No, I'm not talking about any person personally, but perhaps the issue behind it is that the cultural differences and cultural convergences are categories that people use for strategic purposes. You and I, of course, don't believe in sort of this grand generalization. But then, of course, once we get into a piece of work, just as, for instance, when literary scholars would analyze a novel as a text, then you get into all the nuances, you're absolutely right. Coolhouse himself has all these, all the past. Well, to give you another example, Jean Nouvel, in one of his books, he said, somehow after 1968, most of the radical architects in France stopped building. They refused to build out of protest, right? And then, of course, they all become big names. They're building again. So that sense of irony, as you have said, that should be worth looking into if you really get into architecture history. In other words, how do they cope with the sort of this kind of a inexorable march toward post-modernity or the post-financial wealth, whatever you want to call that? This is something that if I were an interviewer, I would like to interview this idea. At which point do you feel that? Are they making compromise or do they find reason? But of course, I think in New York Times, I once read an article about, they're interviewing all this architect. For instance, Daniel Lipskin, basically refused to work for any totalitarian regimes. But then they asked him about China. And he says, if I'm working for a democracy-related project, I will be most eager to join in. The question is, what is a democracy-related project, right? He never answers that question. CCTV, all right? After all, it's CCTV. Has anybody looked at this, what I consider to be a more fascist, Nazi-looking shape? Is that irony? It's a big joke. See, Coolhouse is a very, very educated, well-educated man. I think he had a big joke in the Pravda store. If you go to, I'm sure you visited in New York, Lower Manhattan, there's a Pravda store. I walked in and I saw Foucault all over it. It's a prison. It's a prison. You see that he reads his Foucault. I mean, he's having a big laugh out of doing the fashion store. So architecture really designates new meaning. And this is why I invite all of you to get into it so that we can have our voices. But this is my own personal view. I may be putting it rather strongly. Thank you.
There's some question in the back, and then did you want to say something?
Hi, I really appreciated your last sentence where you said that if there is a story, it has to be involved in the building. And probably this is the only way to define good design, to distinguish good design from bad design. I was wondering at the same time, is it really impossible to devise some traces of the history in the super modernist skyscrapers like Jimtao? For sure, I would say they bring the trace of an erasure, the erasure of the people who worked to build them, and probably also the erasure of the more recent memory, as the metaphor of the pagoda explains. So, do you see some? Can you see some traces too of another history in those buildings?
Oh, yes, you want to do that interpretive take, that's fine. I thought in this audience, you don't need me to do it because everybody is very, very, very knowledgeable about Western architectural art history. Apparently, according to the limited amount I've read, there seems to be a kind of a recovery of modernism of the 1960s, 50s and 60s. Le Corbusier has been resuscitated by Japanese architects. In fact, they had a big celebrative exhibition of Le Corbusier, and they took him very seriously. Of course, they did not take his sort of fantastic city idea seriously, but they take his design, his form, his technique very seriously. Certainly, no building comes to me sort of is built out of the blue. I'm sure there's a history, there's a sort of a inheritance from the past. Presumably, we are entering into a new age. Namely, we have passed, we have gone beyond postmodernism, post-constructivism, etc., according to some of the scholars. It's not for me to say. But the globalization process means for me the more intricate conjunction of different trajectory, of different histories, of different stories. In other words, we may have to do the tracing simultaneously and to see the conjunctures. This is personally what I like to see happening. The whole process of doing it. I think we're still in a kind of experimental process. So who knows, in 5 years, the situation will be very different.
Okay. And influenced by a Western firm, SOM, and the other one is the native Chinese one. I wonder if that accords too great an agency to the foreign architect. If in fact the differences between these two projects have more to do with the nature of the projects themselves. One is an academic institution that has its goals. The other one is an investment property that has its goals. And is it not true that there are Chinese architects who are aspiring to create Jimao Towers, and are there also foreign architects operating within this territory who are aspiring to create thoughtful, sensitive work like the Shangsan project itself? And is not the Jimao Tower a project that has come about only by the complicity of local Chinese as well, so that the local Chinese themselves said, yes, we are a pagoda. Just as in Taiwan, local Taiwanese said, yes, we are bamboo. And it's not so true a story that the foreign architect has so much power over a country's own perception of self.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
I forgot to mention a little bit, this Jimao Tower is 88 floors high, or within one of the three sort of key men in the firm. They invited their Chinese clients to a Chicago restaurant. And then he looks at the watch, it's 8 o'clock, 8 minutes past 8. That's how they say, all right, we'll build 88 stores. But of course, if you can, in Hong Kong, you are Cantonese speaking, then you see 88 is a very good number. Fa fa, ba ba, fa fa. Prosperity, right? So the Hong Kong tycoons would like to have their sort of car numbers as 88 or something. So I mean, meaning ought to be inscribed onto it. That's for sure. I mean, you can do all kind of interpretation of that. Yeah, and somebody like Wang Shu would never build a skyscraper, but SOM specializes in skyscrapers. So for that, there's sufficient justification. I guess what I'm talking about is basically the kind of consequences, the kind of contextual implications. So to follow up the supermodernism idea, see, can a building be truly neutral? Can a building be sufficient unto itself merely by the magnificence of its materials or technology, right? This is what I'm trying to, contextual issues, to open up for discussion. I certainly don't have any answers to it, because in this age of specialization, I'm just amateur. Very few architects will consider themselves to be amateur architects, except one, as Mr. Wang Shu. He openly says that he's an amateur. He loves the idea of 业余建筑师, because he uses a modern Chinese term to a Ming idea, because Ming calligraphers are all amateurs. Ming scholars all dabble in painting, portraits, and all that. And they take great glory in being amateur, because that idea is an old Chinese idea you can also go back to. But of course, nowadays, most people do not go back to that far, because once you go back that far, you are arch-conservative. No. But I'm saying that even if we forget about sort of this kind of feudal past and concentrate on the modern era, namely the 19th and 20th centuries, there are sufficient complexities in all the crisscrossing storytelling in the background behind almost any building built in Asia. Because this is the old issue. When modernity comes into a different location, Western modernity, that is, this whole baggage takes on a different sort of a face. You call that alternative modernity, you call that anything else, but that's the fact. I'm just trying to push for more complications, so to speak, more interpretations, rather than to accept the official view or the propaganda view. The Chinese officials loved it. You talked about it. In fact, there's a kind of people are deploring about the lack of a sufficient public voice in China. You ask the average Chinese person, they don't care. They say, oh, this is great. I love to take a bath there. See, they don't care. But I encountered every single Beijing resident and I asked him about this egg. This is when the opera house had been built. They call it something like egg. Nobody loves it. Everybody hates it. almost uniformly without one. But if you ask the typical Shanghainese, maybe half of them would like the Jinmao Daxiao. That's another story.
We've been talking a lot about I don't think so. We've been talking a lot about like CCTV since this
You cannot
like
hear it well.
and
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm actually really interested in the TVCC, which is next to it, and which is a tower which got on fire, I think last April. And for me, it was like one of the most striking things is to see this contrast between each building. And I was wondering, because I heard like many versions about this, like why this building got into fire. Some people said it was like the workers who did like fireworks, and then the building was made out too cheap material, so it got actually on
You
fire.
mean when they're building the Jinmao Tower? Or what?
The
pagoda.
CCTV and TVCC in Beijing.
Oh, CCTV people.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Oh, you're talking about, okay. All right.
And
See,
I was wondering,
that I
like,
don't know.
I was wondering
haven't-
if there is a plan to tear it down or to rebuild it. I heard it was like a Hong Kong honor, and since it was like a sign of maybe bad feng shui, it will, like, I was wondering about like this kind of negative building in front of the CCTV, and what you would say about it.
Well, I really cannot answer that question because, in the back of the whole, all the names are listed, and in the interviews you can see there are some of the outstanding architectural historians and scholars are quoted. So this is not a sheer real propaganda per se, and not every CCTV program is propaganda, of course. Some of the programs are very good. But what I'm showing this is to give you what I would call an official version nevertheless. Because the critical voices, I have yet to see a critical commentary, a whole series criticizing these buildings. Now, the official one also is the mainstream one because I would say that a sufficient segment of the Chinese consider this to be a source of great pride to have all those gigantic buildings. I may be in the small minority who hate skyscrapers. Now, here's my stance. I hate every single skyscraper in the world, maybe with the exception of Rockefeller Plaza, because it's sort of playful a little bit, or because of a Hollywood movie. Seattle, Sleep at Seattle, or not Rockefeller, what's the other guy? Yeah. I hate the building, but I like the movie. The building is awful. Yeah. So, but I do believe this word mainstream. I think there's a mainstream version, and then there are the alternative minority versions. I guess for an academic conference like this, it would be interesting to look out for some of the alternative interpretation to complicate the issue, so to speak. But if you're in mass media studies, I think it really makes a very interesting project to look into how certain documentaries are made. But I will give you another sort of a piece of commercial. The famous Chinese director Jia Zhangke is now making a documentary about Shanghai. He interviewed me, and of course, I did my number about, Jinmao and all that. I don't know whether he will cut all the interviews or not. But now here's a critical voice, if you know his movies, right? So then we'll see whether this is right. I'm sure this is timed with the Shanghai Expo. So next year is a very important year because all these sort of master narratives or small narratives are going to collide. I'm sure it's going to be a noisy year. I hope you all come back for that. Jia Zhangke's film is going to be shown. So we'll see whether because he did write a book about Chinese workers. And here you have, if you compare architecture with Chinese working class, you certainly have more books, more alternative voices about workers, peasants, economy, even media, but very little about architecture, as far as I can see. I know there are 3 or 4 major architectural magazines. There's one scholar a journalist called Wang Jun, who has toured cities, who has written. His is probably one of the few critical voices. But most of the Chinese architects do not want to talk. Unlike Coolhouse, they do not talk much. They consider themselves to be servants to their clients. Particularly in Hong Kong, not a single architect seems to like to talk. So I try to get them to join the discussion. It's very hard. But again, I was proven wrong because now we do find people like Zhang Chonghe and others, sort of, I have great respect for him because he really, in his very well-mannered, sort of a subdued way, he's staking out his own voice. Whether you agree with him or not is another question, but I think there are more and more people like him in China. They're just emerging this minute.
What happened to architects after 1968 is something that interests me a lot, and I had reservations about Coolhouse at CCTV. But my short question then is there a categorical difference between the work of a design intellectual, say Coolhouse, and the work of other sorts of intellectuals, like academics visiting China? So that's the question. When we focus on the question of architects at work in a context like China, is there a categorical difference between the sort of intellectual work that they're doing and the sort of work that other intellectuals do?
Well, the easy answer would be there's no difference. A lot of people have said that. In fact, some of the Chinese scholars have said precisely the thing, that architecture, they're talking about form and all that. So basically show that. But scholars like me considered otherwise. I think there are more differences than being a Western academic and a Chinese academic. Talk about power and money. There's no comparison between Coolhouse with his OMA and this Wang Shu, who is a teacher, as far as I know. He's a one-man firm. So if you put that Wang Shu to be in Iran, it's the same. So I'm I'm not talking about, how should I put it, on this abstract theory level. I'm talking about the sort of complexities in a practical area. Now here it makes all the difference. Coolhouse did a major work on the Great Leap Forward, but as far as I know, most of the research are done by his students. He has no time to do it. But he has the great intelligence to put all these things together. In other words, without Coolhouse, you cannot have this book. And this is unlike any book written by Chinese studies scholars, my colleagues say, in Chinese sociology and political science, because it takes a kind of architectural intelligence to do this. But why would Coolhouse do such a book? Why doesn't he just write about, architecture and all that? He has done a lot. He's one of those people who have written a lot and talks very, apparently eloquently about various subjects. So there has to be some kind of a connection, that is to say that he is getting interested in China. My position is that I welcome all people to be seriously interested in China. But once you're interested in China, once you're interested in any culture, I would say, do not, especially for intelligent men and women, do not rest at a superficial level. I'm against superficiality. I don't believe in the principle of superficiality. That's just a facade. Because if you like to be neutral and superficial, others were putting things in your own voices. It's like authors, I don't want to do anything. But then you can always say that the building speaks for itself, just like the text speaks for itself. But of course, now you have the reader's response theory in literary criticism, right? Readers, I as a reader, you as a reader, we have different readings. Same in architecture, it seems to me. With more complications, because after all, it's a collective building. And a lot of people use one building. So you have many voices. That's what I personally consider to be architecture to be even more important than literary text. As far as I can see, there's not a single great work produced anywhere in the world, period. The last great novel I read is My Name is Red by Pamuk. Not a single work by Philip Roth is that interesting. All right. And yet, in architecture, you have quite a dozen of interesting buildings, quite a few, more than a dozen, which are targets of debate. This is why architecture is so interesting to me. So I'm really trying to sort of muddy the waters, so to speak, to invite all of us to join in to see. And then probably I would say that if I do have a purpose, that architects will be more responsible. When they open their mouths, they'll have to answer to questions. But unfortunately, in this area of specialization, we don't have a chance to debate Coolhouse. Right? I thought you were going to invite Coolhouse here. Then I'll come here to debate him. But of course, he's going to win because he talks English much more fluently than I do. But that's another story.
My question is related to the discussion you just offered us, and it's in light of appreciating your comment for Wangshu as compared to the Jin Mao building. But part of what strikes me in this emphasis of what Coolhouse has said or not said about China, every time I hear this quote about Shenzhen speed, for example, I think that's really Hong Kong speed plus the absence of kind of fabulous absence of deregulation in Shenzhen in the 1980s under reform. It's about some other things that come together in Shenzhen. And so it strikes me that I wonder about why we want to sort of directly quote Starchitects in this period in a way that I would otherwise think we might want to interrogate or unpack some of this commentary. And so I'm interested in why you're interested in this debate perhaps right now, because in light of our conference and our workshop, I think it strikes us that there's something more fundamental perhaps, or something very interesting and moving about what design means in the present circumstance of global and comparative urbanism. And that there's some getting in and around this emphasis on what architects say, but a more fundamental sense of repositioning, something about power in relation to design and the contemporary city. And I just wonder what you think about that.
So that's fine. Okay. Yeah, got it.
Hello? Oh, okay, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I just have a very kind of straightforward, simple comment type question for you. I guess I'm wondering, and it's more like a hermeneutic or an interpretive question to get us to start thinking about how we are talking about space and how we interpret space and how we make spaces meaningful for us. And it seems to me that you're trying to position or point out two notions of reading space. One that you're more comfortable with, one that you're less comfortable with. If I'm understanding you correctly, you will please correct me if I'm reading you incorrectly. But the space, or the way I think you would like to interpret space, is one in which the body is somehow unfolded or positioned within space in a sort of really bodily, physical way. You talked about, a narrative of spatiality unfolding as the body moves through space versus the sort of meaning that is imposed or ascribed to space. I guess the latter of which would be something that's familiar with Lake Capital and how we make sense of our world in Lake Capital. But I'm not quite sure how we escape from the superficiality that seems to be related to the type of imposition of meaning upon space that you seem uncomfortable with. And I'm wondering if we should not, in fact, embrace superficiality instead of want something more.
Yeah, so there is a city that is called Gurgaon, which has come up on the outskirts of New Delhi in the last 15 years. This is a city that looks very much like Shanghai in some respects, without the towering skyscrapers. The buildings are all built entirely of glass. And there is a design to the buildings, although I think it would be more accurate to say that the buildings have a design on the environment. They have cannibalized the environment. So that what you have in this kind of place are buildings which have, for example, 24-hour water supply when on the outskirts you have no water at all, right? Now my question is really the following, that in response to that, there are architects such as an Indian architect by the name of Laurie Baker, who has come up with buildings that deploy local materials, buildings that are sensitive to the climate, the environment, so forth and so on. And yet, the minute his buildings come up, in architecture terms, this becomes a form of vernacular modernism, if I may put it this way. And it seems to me that there are two kind of related, questions. One is that whenever we think of cosmopolitanism, it seems that the template still remains something called Europe or the Anglo world. And everything else is an alternative cosmopolitanism, it is a vernacular cosmopolitanism, and so forth and so on. So if that's the case, what are the conditions under which a heterogeneity of creativity is possible that does not fall under the rubric of this schema that we already have in place? Because, my concern here is that in critical theory, at least of the kind that I've been interested in, that one can think of something called critical traditionalism. I wonder if something comparable to that can be thought of in the realm of architecture. Whether, in other words, you take it outside the template of this vernacular modernism, so forth and so on. Is there a kind of traditionalism that is a kind of a critical traditionalism that you can find in the concept of architecture?
For the first two questions, the answer is very, very easy and simple. I would love to talk about design, except I know so little. And besides, Archibald wants me to talk about architects, so next time perhaps. But that point is that, buildings may have a design on the environment, so that will link up the two. In my hometown of Hong Kong, now I consider myself a native Hong Kongese, I think there are certainly more talents in design than the number of architects. If we can separate the two, I see the two as interrelated. The other question is whether superficiality, well, I really haven't done that because there's a whole spate of theories you know very well about superficiality. This whole postmodern notion of superficiality, the surface. In fact, we're dealing with a world of surfaces, simulacra and all that. Of course, a lot to be said. But I guess I stake myself in a position of somewhat conservative one that even surfaces can hide meaning. Then you can ask me what meaning means. Then I have no answer. I don't know how to answer. Then you have to contextualize that, to see the sources. And that goes back to your question, which I consider the most fundamental question. I have no ready-made answer to this. We could easily rationalize about the sort of the Western theoretical apparatus because we're all enveloped in one single modernity, as Jameson and others would say, the Western modernity. And then you have different takes, different shifts and changes. And therefore, we use the Western vocabulary, modernism, vernaculars, and all that. The word vernacular somehow strikes a kind of a fake, or maybe not so fake, local ring. See, for instance, Chinese movies are supposed to be vernacular modern movies, right? There's no classical sort of non-vernacular ones, right? So that's another term that is sort of a somewhat ambiguous, amorphous. But if you ask me, if you push me to find a kind of alternative grounds for interpretation, I would say that as far as China is concerned, I think the last 200 years have undergone tremendous transformations. There are certainly dissident and opposing stances and discourses within Chinese culture, in literature, in philosophy, in history, in politics, and everything. In architecture, it's somewhat difficult to locate. Maybe I'm somewhat ignorant to it, but also in city design and all that. But I would say that if you trace back a little, I'm now sticking myself into somewhat dangerous ground. If you go back to the Ming period, forgive my pedantry, I would say that the whole Ming intellectual trend was the alternative, sort of a latent dissident stance against official Confucianism. So the garden, in a way, is a dissident construction. The Wenren idea, literary idea, if you want to inject more issues into it, and this is also the era, the 16th century and late 16th, early 17th century, when issues of gender and everything are raised, including aesthetic. And this happens to be the period when the garden building became thriving. But whether gardening can be considered to be a source of Chinese architecture, that's debatable. I think the locus classicus for Chinese architecture is still the old textbook by Lin Huiying and her husband. This is translated into English, published at MIT, but of course, most of the architectural samples are palaces, temples, and buildings, not enough sort of everyday housing. I think if you ask Zhong Acheng, who's here, Acheng and others, I would say that in contemporary Chinese architecture, common people's sort of prosaic housing is precisely the alternative. So the generic housing, apartment buildings, sort of bland apartment buildings, that's the kind of vernacular, that's definitely the alternative or the opposing voice to the skyscraper. You can Zhong Acheng that, I'm sure, because recently, last year, he curated the Chinese exhibition, the architectural exhibition. It is called generic housing. I think it's a purposeful twist of the whole idea. Namely, generic meaning sort of just a bland housing for everybody that you can do. And yet, you get a lot of meaning out of it. That would be some way of interpreting that. But I would say, unless people can prove me wrong, that there's no clear-cut architectural foundation or a foundation architectural theory that, so to speak, gives us sufficient resources to evolve a new vocabulary in order to talk about, buildings in Delhi and others, But of course, in cultural studies, as you know, a lot of people are using, particularly scholars from India, are using, say, communitarianism from Indian tradition and this and that, in order to justify the alternative positioning vis-a-vis some of the mainstream Western theories. But the Chinese architects and the Chinese scholars are somewhat reticent about it. When they come out with a blatant sort of Chinese way of doing things, they tend to be very simplistic. Now here's my critique. The Chinese said this, the Chinese tradition has that. No, that's very simplistic. To me, it's superficial. Chinese culture is far more complicated than that. So I think if we have enough discussion, if enough interest generated by the recent issue of architecture, probably we can uncover some of these latent traditions. This is only as much as I can tell you at this point. Let me go home and do some more reading and talk to more people, then maybe I can give you a better answer.
On that note, we have to conclude. So